The 4 decades of rock on 106.1 Rock Radio. All this week, the 90s. Grunge gets rid of glam, the boys from Burnage make it big, and the biggest band in the world was the Rolling Stones. Again. Today, life.
When we've talked with other people about the music of the decades, the 3 previous decades, 60s, 70s and 80s, we tried to connect the music that was around with what was going on, how people were feeling, how people were living. There's been this idea that bad times produce great music, but the 90s, good times, bad times, are we too close to the 90s to make our minds up about them yet?
I think at our age we're too close, but I think if you're about 18, 19 now, I mean, you do get 90s nights, don't you, at colleges, like you get 80s nights. It does tell the story of a generation. Yeah, of course it does. I mean, Britpop was the high water mark when we just come out of one of those mini recessions of the early 90s. People had a little bit more money. People wanted to have a good time. And then New Labour came in. There was a birth of lad culture, Loaded magazine. There was a post-football thing, you know, when people got back into football, gathers tears. People for years been sniffy about being into football, suddenly started supporting teams. Students got a bit more kind of lads in their outlook. People started wearing train shoes instead of Doc Martens. And that kind of terrorist kind of culture kind of look, which had been percolating in the 80s, started in Liverpool, maybe in Manchester, the argument goes on forever. Oasis and Blair were the soundtrack to this.
Are we looking back at the 90s and with nostalgia? Are we thinking, thank God, like you said, it's like driving to Germany, you've got to go through Belgium, and you just want to get through it. Was it just a decade that we sped through?
I don't agree at all. I think the soundtrack was really fantastic. I think the Nirvana records sound ace to this day. Oasis, are continually people sniffy about Oasis, but they do make really great records.
Are people going to look back at Oasis in 20, 30 years' time like we've been looking back at bands now and think, what was all that about? They were just a half-decent pop band who just got lucky. Or are we going to look back at Oasis the way we look back at The Who, The Kinks, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles?
Oasis will eventually get re-evaluated as being a really great band when there's a distance away from them so people forget about it. Because the trouble when you get massive, you become a tabloid headliner, people forget about the music, and that's become their problem. But they actually make really great records. If you sit down and listen to their records, they're really great rock and roll records, and he is a really great singer, Liam Gallagher. Liam and Noel Gallagher were 2 most famous English people in the 90s. You know, they were really, really massive, and people kind of forget that, because the thing about, again, like that tabloid thing, it kind of blurs how famous you are, don't it? You're just always in the tabloids, and people forget about it. I always think that's the same happens to the Beatles in a way, that they're so famous, people actually forget about the music, you know, it just becomes... The story becomes more important than the soundtrack.
To me, the music's far more important, so I don't really let anything get in the way of the music. But we're actually thinking of not actually playing any music on the rest of the tour, and just bringing some hotel furniture with us and just smashing it up on stage for an hour and a half, because that would be far more exciting to the media in this country, I would imagine, and maybe decapitate a few cardboard cutouts of famous people or members of the royal family or something, wouldn't you say?
I think when we talked about the 80s, there was an enormous effect of, particularly in music, of a lot of great stuff being created as a reaction to Margaret Thatcher. How much of what was done in the 90s, I don't think nearly as much, but creatively, was a reaction against Mr. Tony Blair, who seemed to be in power for virtually the whole decade.
But I don't think political comment has ever died out in music. It's still there. You've got bands like Rage Against the Machine, who are like enormous bands, like a stadium band. And whether you know, they did simplify political things, but they did make political statements and hints of political stuff, and they were bigger than the Clash were at the time in punk days. So it's kind of interesting to think that people always say it's not like in my day, people don't say this or that. Nowadays, you know, the youth, they just sit around and they take it, but they don't at all, you know.
Our generation seems to be much more politicised than the 90s generation.
I think it's still there. I just think it becomes blurred because it's been done so many times that people don't notice anymore. I think the first time in the 60s when people made mainstream pop political songs, there was such a novelty that people really took notice. But when you actually sit back and look at it, Bob Dylan didn't actually sing anything directly political. He became to represent stuff.
It was a decade of apathy. Think about protest songs from the 90s, and there's Rage Against the Machine, yeah, in the States, but that tradition of British music that was anti-establishment.
I mean, the Rolling Stones are the most famous anti-establishment band. You couldn't get any more establishment than the Rolling Stones. I mean, all they wanted was the country mansions to themselves. That was their revolution. They made great music doing it, but they weren't revolutionary in any way at all.
So is there a rock tune from the 90s that you think sums up the decade in terms of the British experience?
I would say lyrically cigarettes and alcohol in a way, but not because it's political, but maybe it is political statements, isn't it? That that, sod it, I'm going to have a great time, is perhaps the most political statement that
it was,
ever made.
yeah. In 90s, if there was a sentence that sums up the 90s for a lot of us, it was, sod it, I'm going to have a good time.
Which is the key revolutionary statement that ever gets made in any pop music. Right from Elvis wriggled his hips in 1950, whatever it was, on American TV, right through to anything,
You know the problem with that, sod it, we're just going to have a good time, though, that we thought in the 90s?
There's always a hangover.
We've just got the bill.
Yeah.
And do you know what? It's a sharp intake of breath, my friend.